Ladies, gentlemen, and everyone else, welcome to the Thai Philosophy channel. Now, I must apologize first because the video that is supposed to start this channel has gone through quite a few different alterations, but this is what life does. It throws you a number of curveballs, and you've got to find a way around it. But rather than wait and extend time to upload, I thought it best for me to start with this first upload. So for today's discussion, I thought, what's the best way to start a philosophy channel? What's the best way to talk about things? It might be to start with emphasizing the importance, the gravitas of philosophy. It might be me introducing myself as someone who's really an amateur, but passionate, who loves this topic, who loves to think about things that, for the most part, people take for granted. And I thought also it might make sense for me to, drop something deep and esoteric to impress everyone with, my smarts. But really, on the whole, I thought it might make more sense for me to just be honest and say, I want to let philosophy be freed from the shackles of academia, be freed from this hallowed place that a lot of the people who are still doing it try to preserve. And I think they try to preserve it because to everyday people, the questions that seem to be coming out of it are cafe metaphysics. Is the chair really there? Do souls exist? Questions which practical people seem to think, well, why are we discussing this? The world has actual problems. Why would you spend your time looking up in the clouds, having your feet off the ground? Karl Marx himself, famously argued that he's not a philosopher because philosophers have tried to explain the world, and he's more adept at trying to change the world. I mean, fair enough, Karl. You make a very good point, but I think that this subject is quite important, and it's important for reasons that several people don't fully understand. And perhaps it's cliche, but we're going to talk about someone who I think is the patron saint of discussing philosophy broadly, at least in the Western canon, and that's Socrates. Now, to talk about Socrates, it's important to talk about him being the gadfly of ancient Athens. And two things have to be remembered when we speak about this guy, right? He famously is responsible for the Socratic method. We don't have anything written by him. We don't so much have as a sentence written by him. All we have are stories from his neighbor Xenophon and the writings of his pupil Plato. Plato, I think rather cheekily, tries to assume that we will believe him when he says that he was nothing more than an amanuensis to Socrates, that he was simply a stenographer recording the great man's words. No, I don't think so. Plato was the great Alfred North Whitehead said famously that all of Western philosophy is but a footnote to Plato. So I think he was being a little bit facetious when he said something like this. But to think about Socrates, he never wrote anything down. And he was right. He was speaking at a time when Athens had been defeated. So he comes from a culture that had been beaten by the Spartans in the Great War. And for any people that are defeated, for anyone who's defeated, there are ruminations on why you failed. You went to war because you believed in something. You wanted to defend yourself. You wanted to maintain a certain way of life, and you lost. And a wise person, when they're defeated, tends to look at themselves and try to discover why they lost. And so he's speaking to an Athens that has been shaken, that is questioning its own beliefs. And you'd imagine, if you're a leader in this time period, that what it means to be Athenian is important. It's no surprise then that the gadfly of Athens, the one who broke a lot of conviction, the one who questioned a lot of people's family-held beliefs, was eventually sacrificed. He was put to death for corrupting the youth. What corruption was this? He was asking questions that went beyond sophistry. He was a student of sophistry himself. He learned how to make arguments that were rhetorical in the public square. And the goal of sophistry, if at the risk of reducing it, was to be able to break down an opponent, to be able to question their assumptions, leave them in linguistic confusion. The goal was to win. And often, because that goal was to win, it meant that with rhetorical flourish, you could defeat your opponent, you could slam dunk them, sort of like we do now on Twitter, where we clap back. And that means we've won because we've won a certain verbal exchange. And to Socrates, this was not something that I think he would appreciate. He called himself the gadfly because in ancient Greek mythology, I hope you can't hear the truck going off in the background. This is highly unprofessional. But in ancient Athens, the fact was that the gadfly was shown as something that was breaking people up, that would destroy the hubris of great warriors. Stories told of the man who tried to ride winged Pegasus up into the heavens, trying to reach Mount Olympus so that he could assume his place amongst the panoply of gods up there. And Zeus, rather than sending a thunderbolt, decides to send a gadfly who stings Pegasus and throwing the warrior back to the ground in utter defeat. Socrates was this gadfly. He saw himself as asking the people who were sure and confident, the people who thought that they had an understanding of what law is, what justice is, what way of lifestyle made sense. And he would ask those questions, usually just trying to prime and see if people actually knew what they were talking about. Famously, he said that he knows one thing and that he doesn't know anything. When the oracle at Delphi called him the smartest and wisest man of them all, it was, sort of taken that the fact that he was willing to question himself, to live an examined life, that's what made him wise. But this wisdom was an irritant. It took ideas, things, and ways of living and shook them up. If you think about your life right now, you're too busy trying to make do. You have a job, you have a family, you have your studies. Why would you want to examine all of that again? Why would you want to pull at the thread of existence and risk falling through? Bertrand Russell, when asked why there's typically a rather dismissive attitude towards philosophy, put it like this. He says, quote, "Many men under the influence of science or of practical affairs are inclined to doubt whether philosophy is anything better than innocent but useless trifling, hair-splitting distinctions, and controversies on matters concerning which knowledge is impossible." Russell later writes, "The man who has no tincture of philosophy goes through life imprisoned in the prejudices derived from common sense, from the habitual beliefs of his age, of his nation, and from convictions which have grown up in his mind without the cooperation or consent of his deliberate reason. To such a man, the world tends to become definite, finite, and obvious. Common objects rouse no questions, and unfamiliar possibilities are contemptuously rejected." There you have it, folks. The reason to study philosophy. Science, whether it be physics, chemistry, mathematics, all these at one point were natural philosophy. At one point, the questions that created the world that we live in were nothing more than the musings of awkward, often strange guys, mostly guys, unfortunately, who were trying to figure out this world that they were in. But the quiet assumption that they had is something that you would see at the Oracle of Delphi, which is know thyself. nor the sea I tone. That presupposes that knowledge is possible. The questions of philosophy, whether it be metaphysics, whether it be ethics, all of those presuppose that knowledge is possible. If we take metaphysics, of which the two branches are ontology and epistemology. Ontology, what is there? What is actually in existence? What does it mean to exist? And epistemology, which is about what can we know about what exists? Those two questions are important for us to know what we ought to do. For us to say, if this is the kind of life that we want, can we know how we can go about getting it? Many practical people, for instance, seem to say they have no place for philosophy. It seems silly. It seems like, a bunch of people sitting around a cafe trying to pump themselves up by speaking about things that, seem to be linguistic confusion. But to go back to Russell's words, the world to such a man who doesn't have an understanding of the importance of philosophy, the world becomes so definite, so finite, so obvious. Sometimes I look at the things that I've accepted, the things that make me who I am. Why do I want to have a high-paying job? Why have I pursued the career I pursue? Why is it that I think of my relationships in a certain light? Why is it that my idea of a nuclear family is the way it is? We live in a postmodern age in which some of these questions are being attacked. And our instinct is to resist that because we want a firm ground upon which we can walk. But the question is, we've not yet looked down. We're not quite sure of the ground upon which we're walking. The purpose of this discussion, of this podcast, of this show, is to try and examine those questions. In each episode, I will try to pick out a philosophical idea, a thinker, and try and drill down into it, try and explain my perspective on it. And again, I have to emphasize this is my perspective. It will be informed by a lot of smart, learned people. I might not always get it right, but that's not important because I'm not giving you the right way to live. I'm not going to tell you this is how you should live your life. What I'm asking you to do is examine questions that I'm going to present. There will be some answers. There will be some controversial ideas. Some of them are going to contradict with each other. But that's the point, to present them to you and let you know that in this life you have a choice. You have a choice to pick one idea, pick another idea, maybe split them in half and then combine them. We have a very short time on this mortal coil, which means our time is precious and how we spend it matters. To think that, you are practical and have no use for such discussions is quite silly because you are distilling ideas from the air. Like John Maynard Keynes said, practical men, are not understanding that they are distilling ideas from the air from some long defunct economist. You believe in markets, for instance. That is coming from an idea that someone else had to work laboriously about, theoretically. You believe in love, you believe in angst, you believe in human rights. Do you know what human rights are? Do you know why they existed? To ask ourselves those questions, I think, is highly important. It's highly practical because it makes us the sort of people who will move through life actually engaging with the things that others take for granted. It will allow you to have awe. It will allow you to visit moments that seem inconsequential and make them pregnant with consequence. You need to think beyond yourself. Again, Bertrand Russell, when answering this question, said, unless we can so enlarge our interests as to include the whole outer world, we remain like a garrison in a beleaguered fortress. In such a life, there is no peace, but a constant strife between the insistence of desire and the powerlessness of will. In one way or another, if our life is to be great and free, we must escape this prison and this strife. One way of escape is by philosophic contemplation. So when I speak about Socrates, one of the things I want to take away from this is not so much a re-recording, a retelling of his life. I mean, we all know he was a soldier. We know that he was a teacher. in ancient Athens. We know his student Plato recorded a lot of his dialogues. Many argue that a lot of it might just be Plato putting his words in Socrates' mouth, but that's neither here or there. He was trying to show us that Socrates actually lived a life of examination. And that life, importantly, was brought to an end when he was convicted of a crime which he never really committed. He was accused of corrupting the Athenian youth. Trumped up charges were brought against him. And when his friends came to tell him that, he was either going to be forced to drink hemlock to kill himself, or he could, escape. And by escaping, he could be banished for a period of maybe 10 years and return, after a period of ostracism. No one would have blamed him because several people knew that, these were trumped up charges. When his friends tell him that they could open the gate and he could be let out, he says no. He says no because he has been trying to uphold the fact that as human beings, we can follow rules, that man can set the law up for themselves and they can follow principle beyond anything else. So how could he, the man who is speaking about principle, the man who is speaking about living by your convictions, allow himself to break those very convictions? Instead, he drinks the hemlock. And his last words are, "I owe a cock to someone. Would you remember to pay the debt?" And he dies. A lot is said about the foundations of the Western canon being rooted in Athens and Jerusalem. And both of them begin with a sacrifice. In Jerusalem, the sacrifice is man becoming God, dying on a cross and rising again. From Athens, I think, a more important story of a man who lost his life, who gave himself up with no hope of redemption, except that his ideas would continue to thrive and that we could look at them and say, if this is something important enough that someone died for them, maybe it's important for us to look at what he was saying to us. Contemplation enlarges not only the objects of our thoughts, but also the objects of our actions and our affections. It makes us citizens of the universe, not only of one walled city at war with all the rest. In this citizenship of the universe consists man's true freedom and the liberation from the thraldom of narrow hopes and fears. The tagline for this channel is, it doesn't matter how smart you are if you don't stop and think. And this is what we're going to encourage ourselves to do. I'm going to do my best to explain, to make it entertaining, to make it something that you can appreciate. But if you ever ask yourself why you should do philosophy, just look around you and wonder that every single thing that you see in your life was once someone's idea, was once something impractical, was once something that seemingly the environment never even understood. Our ability to keep asking questions, to keep contemplating, to keep asking why, how, and examining the conclusions that have been around us forever is to unlock our truest humanity. We don't get definite answers, but we have to ask the right questions so that we know where we should be paying attention. The fact that science and history and all these things have been pulled out of philosophy and become their own subjects just means that we successfully were able to find out a body and a way of approaching those questions that can now stand on its own. But deep within there is a philosophy about how we approach it. And I can think of no better way to spend your life than to move around you with circumspection and introspection and say at the end of the day that you were curious. And because of that curiosity, you were able to live a life of awe. Not because great things happened to you, not because you were able to travel and see foreign seas, but because you made the most of what was before you. I pray this is something that you can join. So, please share this link, please subscribe, please like. We're going to have a lot of fun together, but we're also going to have some deep contemplation. And that's what this channel is all going to be about. Thank you, and have a lovely day.